In the year 1347, a merchant ship docked in the port of Messina, Sicily. Within days, people in the surrounding town began to die. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and over the next 5 years, it would kill roughly a third of the continent's population. But here is a detail most people overlook. Long before the plague, Europeans had already been dying from something far more mundane: the water. And the solution they came up with was not boiling, not filtration, not any kind of purification system. It was alcohol. Thousands of miles to the east, the Chinese had encountered the exact same problem: contaminated water, and arrived at a completely different answer. They boiled it. And then they turned that boiled water into one of the most sophisticated cultural traditions in human history. Two civilizations, the same deadly problem, two radically different solutions, and the consequences of that split are still shaping what you drink with dinner tonight. To understand why these two paths diverged so dramatically, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when humans first settled near rivers, lakes, and streams and realized that the water they depended on could also kill them. In ancient China, the connection between hot water and health was established remarkably early. The foundational texts of traditional Chinese medicine, some dating back more than 2,000 years, laid out a worldview built on balance, specifically the balance between hot and cold, between yin and yang. In this framework, the human body was understood as a system that functioned best when kept warm. Cold food and cold drink were seen as disruptive forces that slowed digestion, congealed fluids in the stomach, and weakened the body's internal energy. Hot water, on the other hand, was believed to promote circulation, aid the breakdown of food, and flush toxins from the body. This was not a fringe belief. It was the medical orthodoxy of one of the world's most advanced civilizations. And then came tea. The story of tea in China is inseparable from the story of medicine. According to legend, the mythical emperor Shennong discovered tea around 2737 BC when leaves from a wild tree blew into his pot of boiling water. Whether or not that story is true, the underlying point is significant. Tea was first consumed not as a beverage for pleasure but as a medicine. Early Chinese pharmacological texts classified tea as a substance that could clear heat from the body, sharpen the mind, and counteract the heaviness of fatty, rich foods. Over centuries, this medicinal drink evolved into something far more elaborate. By the Tang dynasty, tea had become an art form. Lu Yu, the great tea master, wrote the Cha Jing, the classic of tea, a text so detailed and reverential that it elevated the act of preparing tea to a near-spiritual practice. Tea was no longer just about health. It was about philosophy, aesthetics, and the cultivation of inner calm. But the practical function never disappeared. To this day, when a Chinese family sits down to a meal, especially a meal rich in pork fat, oil, or heavy sauces, hot tea is not an afterthought. It is essential. The belief is deeply embedded. Drink something cold with a greasy meal, and the fat will solidify in your stomach, slow your digestion, and make you sluggish. Drink hot tea, and it will cut through the oil, warm the stomach, and keep everything moving. Walk into almost any restaurant in China today, and the first thing placed on your table will not be a glass of ice water. It will be a pot of hot tea or a cup of plain boiled water. This is not hospitality decoration. It is a health practice with roots stretching back millennia. Now compare this with what was happening on the other side of the world. In medieval Europe, the relationship with water was defined not by philosophy but by a very blunt reality. The water was dangerous. European cities in the Middle Ages were catastrophically unsanitary. Sewage ran through open streets. Animal waste contaminated wells. Rivers that provided drinking water also received the waste of tanneries, slaughterhouses, and entire urban populations. The result was predictable. Waterborne diseases, dysentery, cholera, typhoid were constant killers. And unlike in China, the European medical tradition did not emphasize boiling water as a standard practice. The prevailing framework was humoral medicine, a system inherited from the ancient Greeks that categorized substances by their qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Water was classified as cold and wet, and while it was acknowledged as necessary, there was no deep cultural imperative to heat it before drinking. So Europeans found a different path. They discovered that fermented beverages, drinks where microorganisms had converted sugars into alcohol, were far safer to drink than raw water. The fermentation process, combined with the antimicrobial properties of alcohol, effectively killed most of the pathogens that made water deadly. In Northern Europe, where grain was abundant and grapes were scarce, the solution was ale and beer. In Southern Europe, particularly in France, Italy, and Spain, the solution was wine. And these were not occasional indulgences. They were daily staples. A medieval English laborer might consume 4 to 8 pints of ale per day. Children drank a weaker version called small beer, which had just enough alcohol to be safe, but not enough to intoxicate. Wine was served at every meal in Mediterranean households, diluted with water in a ratio that reduced the alcohol content, but maintained its preservative effect. Monasteries brewed enormous quantities of beer, not because monks were particularly fond of drinking, but because beer was the safest liquid available. Alcohol was not a vice, it was a survival strategy. And here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not expect. The consequences of these two choices, tea versus alcohol, rippled far beyond the dinner table. They shaped economies, social structures, and even the trajectory of empires. In China, the culture of boiling water and drinking tea reinforced a set of values that prized sobriety, mindfulness, and collective discipline. Tea ceremonies became rituals of respect and social harmony. The tea trade became one of the engines of the Chinese economy, eventually becoming so valuable that it triggered international conflicts, most notably the Opium Wars, in which Britain, desperate to balance its massive tea imports, forced opium into China with devastating consequences. Tea was also a technology of public health. The simple act of boiling water, practiced universally across Chinese society for centuries, meant that waterborne diseases were far less prevalent than in Europe, even before anyone understood the germ theory of disease. In Europe, the alcohol solution worked differently. It kept people alive, but it also embedded drinking culture deep into the social fabric in ways that persist to this day. The pub, the tavern, the wine cellar, these became the centers of European social life. Business deals were struck over drinks. Political alliances were forged at banquets where wine flowed freely. And because alcohol was the default safe beverage, European societies developed a remarkably high tolerance for daily consumption in a way that would have seemed alien to their Chinese contemporaries. When Europeans eventually colonized other parts of the world, they brought their drinking culture with them, transplanting vineyards in South America, establishing breweries in Africa and Asia, and creating a global alcohol industry that today generates over $1.5 trillion annually. But here is the deeper irony. Both solutions were responses to the same underlying failure, the inability to provide clean water. And both solutions eventually became so culturally entrenched that they outlasted the problem they were designed to solve. Today, clean drinking water is available in most of the developed world. Water treatment plants, filtration systems, and modern sanitation have eliminated the waterborne diseases that once made raw water a death sentence. Yet the cultural habits persist. Walk into a restaurant in Shanghai, and your waiter will still bring you hot water before anything else. Walk into a pub in London, and ordering a pint remains the most natural thing in the world. Ask an American for a glass of water, and you will receive it packed with ice, a practice that would strike many Chinese people as not just uncomfortable, but genuinely unhealthy. The question of what we drink is one we rarely think about. It feels like personal preference, a matter of taste. But pull the thread far enough, and you find that your choice of beverage is the product of thousands of years of history, medicine, geography, and survival. The Chinese looked at contaminated water and saw a problem that fire could solve. The Europeans looked at the same water and saw a problem that fermentation could solve. Neither was wrong, both worked. And both left fingerprints on civilizations that are still visible today. In every cup of tea poured in Beijing and every glass of wine raised in Paris. The next time you sit down to eat and reach for your drink, consider this. You are not just quenching your thirst. You are completing a ritual that your ancestors began centuries ago, when the most dangerous thing on the table was not the food. It was the water.